So what Paul is saying to them is don't ignore the needs of people around you. He's telling them don't use your freedom as a jumping off point or as an excuse to become self-centered, to only think how this relates to you. Then he says rather, and your translation may say but, because he's going to give you the complete opposite. He says rather, serve one another humbly in love. Now, serve. So the opposite of being self-centered is to serve, right? So he says you've been set free in order to serve. Now, there's 3 Greek words that are used for that word serve, and 2 of them are words that we'd be kind of familiar with and be okay with, like I'd like to serve you this drink, or I'll serve you this meal, or I'll serve you in this way or in this way. Two of the 3 words are used to mean that. The one used here, though, we're not nearly as comfortable with because it's always used in the context of a slave. Putting ourselves in a position of completely at everything to our own expense, serving someone else. This is in reference to a slave. So we're called to freedom, but we're obligated to serve. He says, serve one another humbly in love. The ESV, if any of you have that, that's a more literal translation, kind of flips that around. He says, through love, serve one another. And it's kind of interesting. We lose some of the impact sometimes as we read the Bible in English, because back when this was written, they obviously didn't have punctuation. They didn't have a bold thing that they could hit to try to, bring more emphasis to a certain word. So what the writers used back in this day was word order. And the most important thing they would put at the beginning of a sentence. And then the lesser of important words would come later on down. So in the actual translation, it says, through love, serve. So it's interesting that he's talking about service, but then he seems to flip the table, and all of a sudden he's talking about love being the undercard of everything that there is to do with service. So this says, rather, serve one another humbly in love, or through love, serve one another. Verse 14, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. So the reason that we've been commanded to serve each other is because our service to each other is an open and visible demonstration of what? Of love that we would have for each other, right? How do you know if somebody loves you? Is it because they say it? Because they tell you 5 or 6 times a day? Or is it because of what they do to back up what they're saying 5 or 6 times a day? How do you determine if somebody loves you? By what they do, really, even more than what they say. So as individuals, we kind of need to ask ourselves, who are we serving in love? And even as a church, as we're just in the birthing process, that's something for us to keep in mind today, and each day and each time we're together is as a community. Who is it that we're serving in love? Service is all about love. And parts of maturity, at least the part we're talking about today, this part of maturity is service. We can't say that I want to grow, I want to grow, I want to grow, I want to become deeper, I want more and more and more in my life. I can't say that if it's for my sake only. Okay? Now, obviously, I think all of us would like to grow more mature, we'd like to grow deeper in our faith, but if that desire to grow and grow and grow is strictly for our own benefit, then we're already off track. Jesus said it this way. He said, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And how did he serve? To give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus himself says, I didn't come to be served, but I came in order to serve and to give. The way I'll demonstrate my service and my love is by giving myself as a ransom for many. Verse 15 says this, if you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. This church obviously had some problems, okay? They were, hopefully this is figurative speech, and likely it is. I kind of hope they weren't running around actually chawing on each other or something. But the picture that we're getting here, the bite word is the same word they would use in reference to a snake bite. So they were just nitpicking at each other constantly. Everything that they could find that the other person was doing wrong, they were biting at. And then devour, the word devour is the same phrase that's used to use up one's usefulness. Okay, so they were just using the word devour. The story of the prodigal son, when it says he ran away, and then the same word says he devoured his father's wealth. He used up his father's wealth and had nothing to show for it. It's the same word that they would use in the New Testament when it talked about the Pharisees, how they devoured the homes of the widows. So they were actually taking widows' homes and using them up, throwing the widows out on the street. These were the religious leaders, throwing them out on the street and then taking the money from their home and using it for their own purposes. That was devour. So this is what he's warning this church about doing. You got to make sure you're not biting, you're not nitpicking at each other all the time and actually devouring, just using each other up. If we ever come to the place where we find that we're using people rather than serving them, then everybody loses, right? We're obligated to serve each other out of love. When we serve for any reason other than love, we're only after our own interests. We're being self-centered. Okay, when we serve another person for any reason other than love, there are self-centered attachments to that. I think that's true of any area of life. You know, in our homes, you name it. If we're serving another person because of what we're going to get out of it. That's what was happening in the church in Galatia. They were after their own agendas, and it ended up dividing the church. Again, this is why Jesus says, by this will all men know that you're my disciples, if, anybody know how that verse ends? If you have love for one another. Right. This is how people will know that you're disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, in a way, that's a little bit strange for him to say that, right? You'd almost think he would say, this is how people will know that you're disciples if you love me. I wouldn't have raised an eyebrow if he had written it, said it that way, and it had been recorded that way. It seems to make sense. This is how you'll know you're my disciple, you're following me if you love me. What does he say? This is how all men will know. So people all around us, this is how people around us will know that we're his disciples, if we have love for one another. Now, why is that true? Because people can't see, really, love for Christ, can they? As it stands on its own. People can't necessarily see that we love God. We can say it all day long, but saying it and seeing it are two very different things. So how do people see that we actually love Christ? How do people around us see that we love God? People can see the way we love each other, right? That's what they can see. People can see the love that we have for people who have nothing to give us back in return. That's something people can see. People can see the love that we would have for people that are really hard to love. That's something that people around us can see. People can see the way we love each other. One of the best ways for the world to see that we're actually followers of Christ isn't just to talk about being a follower of Christ, isn't just to talk about being a Christian, but to let them see us loving each other. And how do we go about loving each other? We serve, right? Okay, so how do we get started in this? What do we do? How do we apply that? I mean, that seems huge. And some of us are going, I don't have really time to think about serving too many people and too many, there's a lot of stuff going on. Well, the best place to get started in this whole area is to go home and start. I think the best place to start this as part of our own practice is to go home. And maybe that's one of the hardest places to start at some time. But that's where I think we go and we put this into practice, is right at home. You see, there's something really suspect about a man or a woman who runs out to the church every time that there's a need that comes up, but they won't serve their husband or their wife at home. There's something really suspect about a parent who runs out the door and responds to every need that comes up at the church, but ignores the needs of their children that are at home. There's something really wrong about a teenager that runs from one neat church activity to another neat church activity, staying involved in all really good stuff, but treats their parents like garbage. There's something suspect about that. So I remember when I was in youth work for a long time, and so I dealt with kind of both sides of this coin. And I remember one young lady, a striking young lady, who was a real leader in our youth group. And she led, in so many of the devotions and gave her more responsibility all the time. And I was invited over to their home. And she had very very neat, unique parents. They were really neat to get to know, very generous people. And I watched for 2.5 hours that night this relationship of bitterness and anger and hostility between parent and child. And I had so much trouble at that point, continuing to just let her do what she wanted youth group wise, because she's not applying any of this stuff at home.
That's the cry of our hearts, Lord. We want to be just like you.